Hi. In this video, I'd like to talk about the sacred. This video is actually the first of a pair of videos I'm doing, one on the sacred and the other on the profane. Of course, the idea of the sacred has traditionally been mostly a theological and religious construct, and I'd certainly like to talk about it in a way that relates to that long-standing tradition. But I'd also like to talk about it in a way that appeals to people of a more secular persuasion, mostly because I think that pretty much all of us can benefit from experiencing the sacred. But most of all, I'd like to talk about the sacred in a phenomenological way. That is, as a kind of subjective experience rather than an abstract construct whose existence or non-existence we can debate without resolution for centuries. And here's the usual roadmap of the material in this video. And as usual, you can find this same roadmap in the description section of this video, along with links to the timestamps. So, probably the best way to start this video would be to give you an initial outline of what it's like to experience the sacred, at least from my own point of view, especially so that you can relate to the material in this video in terms of your own personal experience. Of course, I always like to point out in these videos that your own experience may be very different from mine, and that's perfectly okay if it turns out to be true in this case. But anyhow, it seems to me that sacredness is basically a kind of aesthetic experience. That is, an experience of beauty that's particularly powerful and potentially transformative. At one point in his writing, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once famously proclaimed that it is only as an aesthetic event that existence and the world are eternally justified. And so it seems with anything that would fall under the aegis of the sacred. However, it's not really enough to say that the sacred is ultimately aesthetic in nature. That's because there are many possible aesthetic experiences in this life that wouldn't really qualify as sacred, at least not in the strict sense. So then the question becomes, what further qualities are there that differentiate experiencing the sacred from other sorts of aesthetic experiences? Well, as I said, experiencing the sacred is something extraordinarily intense. The kind of thing that can easily feel overwhelming and that can even transform our perceptual fields, our values, our habits, and perhaps even our lives more generally. Basically, experiencing the sacred feels like something extraordinary, something we can't easily disregard or ignore or subsume under the label of business as usual. Part of why it feels that way is that, much like Martin Buber's descriptions of I-thou relation, experiencing the sacred involves the totality of our being. But beyond that, I'd say that it involves perceiving the greater immensity of things, sensing the vastness of the cosmos, for instance, or the infinite transcendent nature of God, or the limitless beauty of the world. Perhaps seeing the world in a grain of sand, as William Blake once wrote. That's why I think it's easy to feel a strong sense of humility and humbleness when we experience the sacred. Basically, to experience the sacred is to perceive our place within the incomprehensible vastness of things, to taste of the infinite, even in the midst of our various human faults and limitations. But at the same time, I'd say that it involves feeling like we're being mysteriously drawn toward that immensity, into a kind of intimacy with it. And as a consequence, I'd say that if there's a mundane experience that's most akin to that of the sacred, it might be the experience of love, perhaps even a kind of eroticism. And as in the case of love, I'd add that experiencing the sacred can easily involve feeling like our lives are somehow being altered by it, colored or imbued by it, perhaps. For instance, I find that one of the effects of experiencing the sacred is that it can easily leave us at least a little bit more open to experiencing it again in the future. Basically, those kinds of experiences tend to snowball over time as we become more permeable and receptive to them. But that wouldn't happen if we weren't being changed somehow by them, perhaps in very subtle ways. And as our openness continues to grow, it eventually becomes apparent that we ourselves are also carriers and manifestations of the sacred. And when you think about it, why should it be otherwise? After all, we perceive the world and relate to it in terms of what we ourselves are. And so, why shouldn't the same principle operate with regard to our experiences of the sacred? Basically, I'd say that experiencing the sacred involves being drawn toward recognizing our own personal participation in it, and hence some intimation of our own inner sacredness, our own inner beauty, as overwhelming and as transcendent as anything else in this life. Okay, so that would be a rough and doubtlessly inadequate outline of what experiencing the sacred is like, at least in my opinion. And with that in mind, I'd like to move toward talking a bit about why I think it's so important in our world. Those of you who watch my YouTube channel in any sort of regular way are probably already well aware that I think that holism is probably the primary lesson the human race is struggling to absorb at this point in history. Basically, holism has to do with recognizing what we are in our entirety, along with our fundamental interconnectedness to each other and to the universe as a whole. Basically, holism is about seeing all that we are in terms of all that is, without rushing to diminish or demote any part of it. In other words, holism is about opening our hearts and our minds to the wider and wilder horizon of reality itself, both internally and externally. However, I would say that learning to experience all of that with an abiding sense of the sacred is an equally important lesson for us at this point in history. After all, it's certainly possible to recognize that all of reality is fundamentally interconnected and still treat that realization as just another propositionally correct truth. Basically, just another arid intellectual exercise. In other words, just because we're able to acknowledge the truth of a holistic perspective doesn't yet mean that we're able to engage that reality in any sort of genuinely meaningful way, as a function of spiritual perception and experience, for instance. And the fact is that intellectual insight without passion, without blood and laughter and tears and everything else that makes life worth living is, well, at the end of the day, it's practically worthless. It's really little more than a thinly veiled form of gamesmanship and manipulation. And I say that not as someone who's trying to cast aspersions on intellectual activity from the outside, but as a college professor who's been on the inside of it for nearly an entire career. But perhaps I should also admit that as an academician, I'm heretical enough to believe that one of the best uses of a refined, agile intellect is to realize the limitations of having a refined, agile intellect. So, all things considered, I'd say that our current struggle has mostly to do with seeing things holistically, especially by way of opening ourselves to experiencing the sacred. In fact, I'd say that practically all of our large-scale problems are rooted in our inability to perceive the living interconnections between each other and the world more generally, as well as our inability to know ourselves in a deep and intimate way, and to honor all of that as something sacred, as something worthy of our veneration. Think about it for a second. How eager do you think we'd be to inflict horrific and sometimes genocidal violence on each other if we were truly able to feel the sacred pulse of our shared humanity? To feel each other's presence and struggles in this world as a reflection of our own? My answer would be probably a lot less eager than we currently are. Or how quick would we be to mistreat our planet if we could truly hear its heartbeat sounding like numinous thunder in our own bodies? Makes you kind of wonder, doesn't it? And so, if any appreciable fraction of that is actually true, well, it begs the question, how might we begin to re-sacralize our world as well as our own lives? Basically, to reclaim the sacred as part of our basic human birthright. How might we begin to learn to see each other and the world we inhabit sub specie aeternitatis, as the philosopher Baruch Spinoza used to say? That is, from the perspective of eternity. Basically, as manifestations of the fundamental sacredness of life, rather than mostly as a bunch of resources to be consumed to satisfy our petty whims and desires. However, before I give my own answer to that question, we should probably take a minute or two to recognize some of the monumental difficulties involved. And first among those would be that the prevailing realities of our modern world make pretty much any sort of resacralization very difficult and daunting. That's because, as Abraham Maslow and Max Weber, among others, have noticed, we live in mostly desacralized times where experiencing the sacred is elusive at best and nearly impossible at worst. The reason is that most of us live in what I call the age of distraction, in a time of pandemic attention deficit disorder. And the unsettling fact is that our primary mode of consciousness is changing accordingly, which is making experiencing the sacred much more alien and bizarre to our habitual mode of awareness. For instance, consider how fixated most of us are on the many computer screens that are proliferating around us, perhaps like the one you're watching right now. And while I would agree with Robert Pirsig that there's nothing preventing us from experiencing the sacred through technology, I'd also say that that rarely happens. What we're usually doing with technology is two things: either using it to solve practical problems or for the purposes of entertainment. Not necessarily in that order, but only very rarely as a portal into experiencing the sacred. At one point in his oeuvre, the philosopher Martin Heidegger described being in the world in terms of what he called the fourfold, which for him consisted of earth, sky, mortals, and divinities. However, it seems to me that in our own era, we inhabit a world with a very different kind of fourfold structure, one where the largest fraction of our lives plays out in terms of the ongoing oscillation between production and consumption on one hand, and entertainment and boredom on the other. To me, that's the fourfold that defines and delimits the bulk of our lives in the 21st century. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that paradigm, it doesn't leave much room for anything that doesn't fit easily within it, such as experiencing the sacredness of things. Sure, there are still believers in our 21st century world, religious and otherwise. And there are still people who care about the sacred. But consider how much time even those of us who fit that description actually spend goofing around on the internet, compared to the amount of time we spend, say, praying to God. I'd say that for the vast majority of us, it's a pretty lopsided ratio. And if you're still not convinced that the exigencies of our age of distraction are constantly displacing our chance to experience the sacred, well, consider how strange it would be if someone asked you how you're doing, and instead of saying, fine, I guess, you said something like, well, actually, now that you mention it, I feel like an immense wave cresting and breaking upon the sacred shoreline of life, like a living coalescence of tidal forces drawing together all that is holy and transcendent. I am an arc of lightning flashing over a fathomless sea, an unexpected intimation of the infinite in the endless night of this world. And since you were nice enough to ask, I feel like I am carrying untold oceans and galaxies inside of myself, like a harbinger signaling the advent of a bold and brilliant world. And you? How are you doing today? And the next sound you'd probably hear at that point would be police sirens getting louder and louder. That's for my European viewers. Car 54, do you copy? We got a code 428 in progress. Caucasian male wantonly expressing the sacred without a license. Subject is armed with a thesaurus. Repeat. Subject is armed with a thesaurus and is considered extremely poetic. Proceed with caution. Over. And then the inevitable screeching of tires. There he is! Go, go, go! Ugh, all right, sir. Just drop the thesaurus and put your hands behind your head. I said drop the thesaurus, sir. You're under arrest. And then a little while later. Hey, what are you in for? Armed robbery and felony assault. What about you? Class violation of sacred speech laws. Oh man, that's rough, hard time. Just don't get your wig split in the pen, okay?
Thanks, I'll try.
Alright, well, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but only a slight one. And as you may well infer at this point, I don't personally take the sacred completely seriously. In fact, I think that comedy and laughter are some of the best ways of getting in touch with it. But anyhow, speaking of poetry, Heidegger also asked, or rather re-asked, what are poets for in a destitute time? Or, in our terms, what is it to be a herald of the sacred in a world that seems to want everything but that? What is it to care about the transcendent and about the infinite in a world like ours? Well, I'd say that the first thing is that it sets up a kind of tension between ourselves and the prevailing way of our world. And so the question is, how can we negotiate that sort of tension in some fruitful way? In a way that helps the world give birth to a world beyond itself and at the same time preserves the integrity of our souls. It's really not such an easy thing when you think about it. And to answer that question, or at least work toward an answer, I'd first like to talk about two strategies that, in my estimation, aren't very good. First, I really don't think much resacralization of our world is going to happen by way of politics and or legislation. God, if only it were that simple. If only it were a matter of just voting the right person into office. You know, the right person with the right ideology who would then enact the right legislation that would force all of us to experience the sacred holism of life. The problem with that strategy is twofold. First, that sort of experience hardly ever happens as a function of legalistic bullying. But beyond that, it's not actually in power's interest to encourage that sort of experience, mostly because power's primary motivation, quite irrespective of political affiliation and or ideology, is always to perpetuate and amplify itself. However, having deep spiritual experiences tends to carry us beyond the outer threshold of everything that makes it easy for power to do that. That's because those sorts of experiences are powerful enough to alter our values, our perceptual fields, and our habits in unpredictable ways, which of course makes it much harder to control us. But beyond that, those sorts of experiences tend to make it painfully obvious how trivial and how shallow political gamesmanship and manipulation really are most of the time. And power definitely doesn't want us to perceive that or anything remotely close to it. What power wants is to keep our attention perpetually fixated on its actors and its theater, on all of the panem et circenses, as we used to say in Latin class, that's bread and circuses. It's the same basic reason why power keeps entheogens strictly illegal in the US, and yet legitimates the kinds of drugs that kill hundreds of thousands of us every single year. It's because power essentially wants to control us, especially by controlling our awareness and our minds, and more specifically, by regulating our access to certain kinds of experience, and thus hemming in our consciousness along with our values and behavior. According to that logic, it's perfectly okay if hundreds of thousands of us die every year from, say, tobacco use. But it's not okay if we start to see deeply into the underlying nature of reality. That's strictly verboten. And so the upshot is that it's highly unlikely that there's ever going to be a political solution to the problem of resacralizing the world, because it's not actually in power's interest to have that happen in the first place. Okay, another strategy that doesn't really work would go like this. Well, okay, then I guess I'll just adopt a completely intransigent attitude where I'll go around constantly complaining, shaming, and pointing accusatory fingers at anyone who isn't actively supporting the obviously crucial project of resacralizing the world. Maybe you could even channel that impulse into some form of social activism. You could start by braying through a bullhorn at your local Walmart about how everyone needs to get with the program. After that, you could graduate to blocking off public roads and highways to force everyone to recognize the supposed importance and righteousness of your cause, blah, blah, blah. You see a lot of that sort of thing in the world these days, but what people who adopt that strategy almost never realize is that it doesn't actually work. In fact, it mostly just irritates and alienates large segments of the population, which then causes them to turn against whatever your project is. Basically, it's a great strategy for converting lots of people who were originally more or less neutral toward your cause into hardened enemies and opponents of it. And then, after a few years of doing that, you can stand around gaping in a slack-jawed rictus of shock and perplexity after the next election cycle predictably carries their champion, who's probably someone who represents the exact opposite of your values, into the uppermost echelons of political power. Surprise! And so, if resacralizing our world isn't likely to happen by simply bullying and shaming everyone into it, and it's also not very reasonable to expect the political machine to do it for us, then how can it possibly happen? Basically, what is there for us to do? Anything? Well, I think that there is a genuinely fruitful path toward resacralizing the world, and it has to do with what I like to think of as becoming a secret agent. Basically, becoming a secret agent, that is, a covert operative seeking deep change in our world, means learning to engage its realities with a kind of double presence. One side of that has to do with adapting ourselves to our world's prevailing conventions, to seem like a more or less predictable, everyday person, for instance. However, the second and more interesting side has to do with what's going on under the surface, namely, agitating for something way deeper than business as usual. And in my view, doing that basically involves learning to become a living conduit for the sacred. It's not about going around browbeating and hectoring people, which, as we saw a minute ago, only produces resentment and opposition. Instead, it's about allowing the power of the transcendent to infuse our very existence and to become perceptible to the people around us, to let it shape not so much what we say, but how we speak, how we breathe, and how we move from moment to moment. It's basically about allowing the sacred to inhabit us and to take up residence in our lives, and then allowing it to express itself through our very existence. But, of course, then the question becomes, okay, but how can we do that? Well, I'd say that the first step is to learn to care about sacredness at least a little bit, even if it's not so easy, and even if everything in our world seems stacked against it. But I'd also say that learning to care about the sacred involves learning to let go of a lot of our usual self-importance and to become humble enough and open enough to allow the sacred into our lives in the first place. To feel its pulse in a very personal, very immediate, and very undeniable way, so that we can convince ourselves of its power and its importance, both for our individual lives as well as for the world more generally. Losing our self-importance, and along with it our egoistic grandiosity, is important to that process because as long as we think we're the most important thing in this universe, our attention and energies will always remain focused on ourselves, on satiating our petty desires, for instance. And as a consequence, our souls will remain perpetually small and constricted, and it'll be incredibly hard to get in touch with the overarching vastness of things and to feel all of the intimations of the infinite that surround us, which I would say is one way of characterizing our 21st century postmodern malaise. So, with all of that in mind, I'd like to end this video by outlining 2 practical exercises you can use to get in touch with the sacred, or to do more of it if you're already having those sorts of experiences. You know, sometimes in my classes I give my students informal non-assignments to try out in their own lives, which I suppose is a little bit of a joke. But then again, I think that a lot of the time we understand things best while we're laughing. And so I'd like to leave you with two non-assignments. The first is to take a minute or two every now and then to gaze into the stars of the night sky, to feel for a few seconds the incomprehensible immensity of the universe, to perceive the contours of its infinite complexity and majesty, all of the ineffable beauty and terror of its clockwork. And in that moment, that crystalline moment shining like the endless starlight above you, let yourself sense how you and I and everyone else in the world are participating in all of that. How we are the universe, becoming conscious of itself. And that if we could summon the courage to live toward that reality, toward what we really are and what we really can be, well, we might just discover that our deeper destiny in this world is nothing less than the fundamental re-sanctifying of all life. And your second non-assignment for today is to let yourself feel gratitude for whatever blessings there are that have found their way into your life, perhaps even for the strange gift of your existence itself. Personally, I find that experiencing and expressing gratitude is one of the best ways of getting in touch with the sacred, mostly because that sort of experience has a way of clarifying our perception of reality, and also because it calls us toward remembering something that's easy to forget. Namely, that we ourselves are bearers of the sacred, that we ourselves are manifestations of God, for instance, and participants in all that is worthy of reverence. Okay, so those are your two non-assignments due later this week. First, re-sanctify all of life by participating fully in universal transcendence. Check. And then, experience gratitude until you start to remember what you actually are, namely, a bearer of the sacred and an active participant in everything in this world that is sacrosanct and worthy of reverence. Check. Oh, and by the way, there's nothing keeping you from doing those two non-assignments in this exact moment right now. Just a thought. Anyhow, that's the gospel according to Eric for today. Thanks as always for listening, and as always, take care of your soul.